Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about the Enlightenment. So, the Enlightenment is a time period in history where the people start to question these absolute monarchs. So, we've been talking about the absolute monarchs, right? These people that have absolute power can do kind of whatever they want in their country. No one really has any say in what they do, whether they're good, bad, whatever that is. So the Enlightenment is all about people starting to question that. And when they question that, they start to think, well, if we don't have a king or a queen in charge, what's the way we should be ruled? What does our actual life look like? So consider this as you're filling out the sheet here. The compelling questions: how was the Enlightenment influenced by reason? What new views did philosophers have about government? What new views did philosophers have about society? And how does the Enlightenment end up spreading? And the big idea here, like I said, European thinkers developed new ideas about government and society during the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment really is kind of it's around a 100-year time period, close to it, between 100 and 200 years, the 1700s through the 1800s. And this is right after the height of the age of absolutism. So when the Enlightenment starts, it's not like all those absolute monarchs leave, right? This is just the kind of um, let down from that time period where they start to transition from a place where you have a king that can do whatever they want into these more complex governments. So this is sparked by unfair rule in Europe, these rulers taking advantage of their power, and people not happy about that. So the thinkers of the time are people known as either philosophers or philosophers. It's kind of an interchangeable term there. And these philosophers, these philosophers, build off the ideas of the scientists in the scientific revolution. So during the scientific revolution, right during the Renaissance, they started to question things like, well, how do our bodies work? How does nature work and crops and stuff like this? Now they're starting to apply those ideas to government, right? What's the correct way we should have a government? And they started to consider, why are there problems in society, right? So not just things about like your kings and queens, but big problems in society, things like crime, things like wealth and stuff like this. How do we adjust for that? So the original two Enlightenment thinkers are John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. These two guys here. These are the two heads at the very top of your page on your note sheet. John Locke, he wrote something known as the Two Treatises of Government. And John Locke's whole idea here is that people are born naturally good. So when you are born, you are a good person. Okay. You are a blank slate. He said tabula rasa, which means blank slate in Latin, ready to be kind of imprinted on. But you're born good. Okay. So your white paper void of all characters. And so he believes, this is kind of in conjunction with that, in a limited government. Essentially, that the government should be separated and only have the power to do so much, right? There shouldn't be a king or there shouldn't be an absolute monarch in charge ruling every bit of your life. The government should be minimal. Life, liberty, and property are unalienable rights. Everyone has those. The second guy on this is Thomas Hobbes, and he wrote a book as well called Leviathan. Now, unlike John Locke, he believes that all people are naturally cruel. So when you are born, you are cruel, you are selfish, you are always going to act in your own self interest. So he believes that's true of everyone. When you're born, all you want is what's best for you. You don't care about how it impacts others. And so he believes that there needs to be a strong, controlling government in charge of society. Basically, that society, if you didn't have a strong government, it'd be kind of like the Wild West out there, right? Everyone doing what they want for their own good and hurting other people. So he believes there'd be chaos and violence if you didn't have a strong government. So very different than Locke, right? So Locke is all about the limited government, only do as much as you can, or only do as much as they're able, and then back off the rest. Whereas Hobbes is all about a strong government. The stronger the government, the better. So Hobbes, he is a fan. He's actually writing this in support of these absolute monarchs. He feels like these absolute monarchs are necessary to keep power or to keep people, functioning, society functioning in the world at the time. He also wrote about the social contracts. We'll talk about the social contract in a second, but the social contract is this idea that for the sake of society, you give up some freedoms. Okay. So to exist in society, you give up your freedoms to do certain things. So we can see over here the social contract. A lot of philosophers wrote about this too. It wasn't just Hobbes, this idea of a social contract. So this idea that there are certain things that you just agree to exist in society, to get the benefits of society, right? To go to school, to walk down the street, to go into a store, to do whatever in society. There are certain things that we just all kind of have agreed upon. Okay. The most extreme example, right? You can't go down the street and kill someone that you dislike, right? We have kind of agreed on that as a society, but also little things too. You can't say certain words without getting pushback from society. You can't do certain things that maybe aren't illegal, but would be frowned upon within society because that's just the way things are, right? So keep that in mind, this idea of a social contract. We will talk more about this kind of as we go. Okay, so we are going to talk next about the English Civil War. So we've talked about the kind of life of the excuse me, had to cut the video there. The We've talked about these philosophers and kind of the ideas, right, that are starting to bubble up, but none of it is putting being put into action just yet, right? There are still kings and queens, there are still monarchs. It's just these people writing about this and kind of thinking about this. Um, where it really starts to begin is in England, okay, in the English Civil War. There are people that are upset about the current rule of the English uh, king and queen and everything like this, and they are calling for changes. So the first monarch we're going to talk about in this English Civil War is James the First. So James the First was the King of Scotland while Elizabeth was still alive. And if you remember back to Elizabeth, right, she was the Virgin Queen. She never got married, never had an heir. So James the First becomes the King of England. And he is a wannabe absolutist, right? He wants the power and he wants the perks really of being an absolute monarch, but he's kind of an outsider, right? People loved Elizabeth. They don't really love James. He's a smart guy, but he really doesn't have much of a grasp on being king. People don't really like him. And this ends up causing a lot of problems with the parliament. So, parliament in England at this time was kind of an advisory group that had some rules for the king and queen. Okay. They did some things like write laws and stuff like this, and he never really got along with Parliament. Okay. Because he was a Anglican. Okay. And Parliament at this time, we haven't really gotten into this much, were a group of Puritans, which the Puritans were these kind of hardcore, um, Protestants that really follow a lot of the old rules and stuff like this. So kind of at odds with the Anglican Church. So this ends up causing a lot of kind of tension and a lot of problems between him and the um, Parliament. So he is still absolute monarch. He is still in charge. But things aren't looking great for James. People are There's a lot of tension here, and once he dies, this tension is going to kind of bubble over with his son Charles the First. Okay, so his son Charles ends up causing a lot of problems. Okay, see, Charles the king of is a son, excuse me, of King James the First, and he is one of those guys that believes in this divine right of kings. Right, my power comes from God. I should have all the power. But he was, again, like his father, not well respected. Um, this problems with Parliament end up kind of bubbling over, and Parliament ends up creating something known of the Petition of Right. Basically, what this says is that the king can't tax people without Parliament's approval. He couldn't declare martial law, so he couldn't just march the army in and do what he wants. You couldn't board soldiers in people's homes, and you can't throw people in prison without charges. So, just some like bumpers, right, on the king's power. But Charles doesn't follow through with this. He signs a petition, but he still taxes people. He also never calls Parliament into session. Basically, for Parliament to work, the king has to say, "Hey, Parliament, I want you to get something done." He doesn't do that for 11 years. Okay. So these religious tensions are boiling over and everything like this, and things are looking pretty rough. Um, Eventually, what this does is Parliament he brings together to get taxes to support a war with Scotland. They resist and try to rebel and get away from him. But they meet on and off with Parliament for 20 years. And eventually he passes a law that says that they have to meet at least every 3 years. So Parliament kind of gets some rules, put into place there. Now, also at this time, over in Ireland, so the neighbor next door, right? Ireland, the island next door, there is a rebellion going on in Ireland, and Parliament needs to put together an army to put down this rebellion. So Parliament proposes that to be in charge of the army, but that they be in charge of the army. But Charles refuses, and he says, and he takes troops into the House of Parliament and intimidates them. Neither side, so Parliament and the king, can't come to an agreement, and this ends up causing a civil war that begins in 1642. So this is an interesting civil war because it's divided into two sides, obviously. You have a group known as the Cavaliers, and these are the king's supporters. So these are the Anglicans, these are the Catholics, and these are the nobles. So it's kind of interesting. You got this group of people that are Anglican and Catholic supporting the king. And on the other side, you have the Roundheads, which the Roundheads are Parliament's supporters. So these are Puritans and basically anyone that's not Anglican or Catholic. Okay. And they are supporting Parliament. And the leader of these Roundheads, these Puritans, is a guy named Oliver Cromwell. Okay. He's the one that ends up leading the Roundheads to victory over the Crownheads. He abolishes the monarchy and they create what is known as the Commonwealth Puritan government. So Cromwell's government is an interesting government. Like I said, he abolishes the monarchy, so there's no longer a king, no longer a queen. Anyone that had kind of those, aspirations fled. They left. They ran away because they didn't want to deal with this leadership. So he's Puritan, like I said. He gets rid of the monarchy and the House of Lords, so the kind of noble house as well, and he declares England a republic. Now, he's a very skilled leader, obviously. He's able to defeat basically the King of England in a civil war. And he's also a powerful speaker. That's how he's able to get so many people backing him. And he rules England as Lord Protector for 5 years. Now, essentially, what that means is he was not a king, okay, but he had control of the army. So, as controller of the army, he had basically complete control over the country, right? Anyone says no, he used the army with them. Um, he wanted to create a representative government, so where you vote, right, on a government, but it failed. It failed twice. He tried to write a constitution and it fails twice. And there were big things that kind of kept him from keeping his power, even though he didn't really even have a government he was in charge of. One, he did very well financially. Okay, they were able to tax people and keep things financially. He had a strong army. Number two, right, disciplined, loyal, and powerful. And his enemies didn't have an organized army, right? These supporters of the king, they were defeated, and no one else is really going to step in and challenge him. Now, ultimately, his government fails to solve problems, and so Parliament ends up inviting back Charles II. Okay, so Charles II to be king again. So that's we're down here on the bottom. And Charles II was the king of Scotland. So he went back to Scotland again, and he was a distant cousin, okay, of James I, and he is son of Charles I, okay. And so he comes back, and he is known as the Merry Monarch. Okay, he returns from exile, and he brings back a lot of the English culture. So the Puritans under Cromwell, they outlawed a lot of things like holidays, things like plays, things like um, public parties and stuff like this because they were a very Puritan type of government. He brings all that back. He brings it back. He avoids fighting with Parliament, but he gets his way. He ends up with an alliance with France, which is a rarity, and he ends up having no children. So his brother is the one that takes over, and his brother is James II. And James II is kind of a return to form to the old ways where he takes power, angers Parliament. His wife dies. He marries a Catholic. No one is happy with James II. So eventually he gets kicked out. And who do they invite? They invite some cousins, a guy named William of Orange and Mary, over from the Netherlands. Okay. So Parliament crowns Mary II and William III as joint rulers, and they end up becoming the King and Queen of England. Now, Mary and William are an interesting thing because they took power from James with no bloodshed. It was known as the Glorious Revolution because really there was an overthrow of power, but there was no revolution attached to it. So William of Orange and Mary take over. All right. So one of the stipulations for England to, or for William and Mary to come back as king queen was the English Bill of Rights. So the Parliament basically makes William and Mary to become king and queen sign the English Bill of Rights. And what this does is it protects the natural rights of citizens. Okay. So remember we talked all the way back when we talked about Hobbes, or excuse me, Locke. He says life, liberty, and property. Those are natural rights of citizens. So you can't impede on these natural rights of citizens. Okay. No cruel and unusual punishment. Any citizen can petition the government. A right to bear arms, freedom from loyal adherence to the law, and freedom of taxes imposed without Parliament's consent. So this constitutional system, this constitution creates a world where the king and queen have limits on their power. And that's where we get the term constitutional monarchy, because yes, there are still king and queen, but the powers of their rule are held in check by laws. Okay, so there is no absolute power really in England anymore. And kind of as a fun fact, England doesn't have a constitution like we have, right? We have a constitution, we have our Bill of Rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. They don't have that. They just have this kind of series of documents that have been compiled over time. So these documents go back, almost 1,000 years, like the Magna Carta. So on their laws are still laws that were written over 500 years ago, and they just add to it. Basically, they just compile this document and add to this document kind of over the years as they go. So it's kind of an interesting set of limits. But some of these things should look pretty familiar to you, right? Because this is right before the American Revolution that this stuff starts coming out. There's starting to be some limits on their power. Um, Things like natural rights, no cruel and unusual punishment, the right to bear arms. These different things are going to become very, very important when the U.S. Constitution is written years later.